"She's not smart enough to serve," my cousin Mark said, loud enough for the security guard to hear, and for the two women behind us in line to share a quick, mean little laugh. "Probably got lost on the way to the library." My aunt didn't correct him. She just tightened her grip on her car keys, let them dangle from her fingers like a nervous habit, and glanced at me, the way people look at someone standing in the wrong line. "Ma'am, you're not on the list," the security guard repeated. His voice was polite but clipped, the kind of practiced neutrality you only get from repeating bad news 50 times a day. "Can you step aside, please?" For a split second, I considered answering him with the truth that my name was on a list, just not the one he was looking at, the truth that I wasn't here because of my cousin's invitation or my aunt's approval, but because the United States Navy had specifically requested my presence. But I didn't, not yet. Instead, I smiled in that mild, non-threatening way that women learn in childhood, the one meant to smooth over friction, make other people feel comfortable, and hide the fire in your chest. The guard held the clipboard like it was a shield. "For Lieutenant Mark Hayes, we have Captain Gerald Hayes, Mrs. Linda Hayes, Mr. Robert Hayes." He went down the list, reading each name with military precision, each one another hammer blow. Mark's parents, his wife, his younger brother, and that was it. My name, my existence, was not accounted for. "Oh, don't worry," Mark said, leaning in toward the guard, his voice pitched just enough for me to catch every word. "She's just here for the free food. Paper pusher. Never made it past basic training." He grinned, the kind of grin that wasn't about humor at all. It was about dominance, about letting the people around us know exactly where I ranked in the unspoken family hierarchy. My aunt shifted beside him, the keys in her hand clinking softly. I'd known her since I was born, and she'd always had the same tells, the small frown, the tiny shake of her head, the way she angled her body away from confrontation. She wouldn't defend me. She never had. I stood there, letting the moment hang, letting the insult settle between us like a fine layer of ash. It wasn't the first time I'd been erased in public, but there was a sharpness to this one, a deliberate edge. I could feel the other guests' eyes on me, waiting to see if I'd fight back or simply fade out of the scene like an unwanted extra. I didn't move. My coat, a plain beige trench, hung loosely on my frame, hiding the uniform beneath. The 2 silver bars on my shoulders were invisible here. The orders in my inner pocket might as well have been a grocery list. The gate to the ceremony grounds was 10 feet away. 10 feet and a lifetime of proving I belonged. The guard's eyes darted from me to Mark, then back to his list. "Ma'am, if you could just step aside." I stepped back, slow and deliberate, feeling the pavement under my heels, the morning air cool against my face. Behind the gate, the white chairs were already filling up, rows of them facing the stage where the awards ceremony would take place. From here, I could see the lectern draped in the Navy flag, the gold fringe catching the sun. Mark glanced over his shoulder at me as he walked through the gate, his hand resting casually on my aunt's arm. She didn't look at me at all. Her gaze was fixed ahead, like the sooner she reached her seat, the sooner she could pretend this little scene hadn't happened. I stayed where I was, letting them think they'd won. The truth was, I wasn't here for their approval. I'd given up on that years ago, after one too many family dinners where my work was dismissed as office stuff and my achievements reduced to safe choices. But today was different. Today, the people who had underestimated me for my entire life were going to see exactly what I had built in the shadows. They were going to hear it from someone they couldn't laugh off, someone whose word carried weight in the halls they worshipped, and they weren't going to see it coming. A breeze came off the water, carrying the faint tang of salt and the faraway sound of gulls. I turned slightly, looking toward the parking lot just as a black government sedan rolled to a smooth stop. The door opened, and I caught sight of the 4 gold stars on each shoulder before I saw the face. Admiral Carson. He stepped out, scanned the small knot of people at the checkpoint, and his eyes found mine instantly. His expression didn't flicker, just a steady, purposeful focus, like he was already 2 moves ahead on a chessboard. "Commander," he said as he reached me, loud enough for the guard and my cousin, who had turned at the sound, to hear. "Glad you're here. We've got a seat for you up front." The guard's eyes widened. "Sir, I didn't realize—" "It's fine," Admiral Carson said, his tone smooth but leaving no room for argument. "She's with me." And just like that, the gate was open. I stepped forward, feeling Mark's stare burning into me from a few yards ahead. He didn't say anything, not yet, but I saw the confusion in his eyes, the quick mental math as he tried to fit this into the neat little box where he'd kept me all these years. I didn't give him time to work it out. The Admiral was already walking toward the front rows, and I matched his pace, the sound of my footsteps even and measured. If my cousin wanted to know why I was here, really here, he'd have his answer soon enough. And it wouldn't be from me, it would be from the stage. When people ask me why I'm so quiet at family gatherings, I usually give them the polite answer, "Oh, I'm just listening," or "I like hearing everyone else's stories." The truth? I learned a long time ago that my stories never seemed to matter, not to them. It started small the way these things always do. I was 10 years old the first time I noticed it. My science project, a working model of a water filtration system made from recycled materials, had won first place in the county fair. I remember clutching the ribbon, the paper edges cutting into my palm because I was holding it so tightly. I wanted to show it to my aunt, to my cousin Mark, to anyone in the family who would listen. We were all at my grandmother's house that night, the smell of her roast chicken filling the air. I walked in, proud and shy, holding the ribbon up for my aunt to see. She glanced at it for less than a second before smiling and saying, "That's nice, honey. Oh, Mark, tell everyone about the home run you hit in Little League today." And just like that, my ribbon went limp in my hand, my moment gone. I learned then that in our family, achievements came in very specific shapes: medals for sports, promotions in the service, public displays of leadership. Quiet wins didn't count. Anything that took place in a lab, a library, or an office didn't register on their radar. By the time I was 17, I'd stopped expecting recognition altogether. That year, I won a statewide scholarship for a paper I'd written on emerging encryption technologies. It was the kind of award that opened doors, a full ride to a university with a top-tier cyber operations program. When I told my parents, they nodded and said, "That's great, but have you thought about applying to the Naval Academy? Your cousin's already training for it, you know." That was the refrain of my teenage years. Mark is already, or Mark just, as if my life was only meaningful in relation to his. My aunt, in particular, had a way of cutting me down without ever raising her voice. At my high school graduation party, she handed me a card with a $50 bill tucked inside and said, "For books. You'll need them, since you're not exactly cut out for anything physical." She meant it as a joke, but the way she said it, light, dismissive, with that faint curl of her lips, told me exactly what she thought I was worth. It didn't stop when I left for college. While Mark went through the academy, his progress was chronicled in real time through every family group chat. Photos of him in uniform, updates on his training milestones, even videos of him receiving commendations. My updates: scholarships won, internships landed, early acceptance into the Naval Intelligence Officer program, barely earned a thumbs-up emoji. I remember one Thanksgiving, halfway through my first tour in Naval Intelligence, when I'd flown in on a 24-hour pass. I couldn't tell them exactly what I'd been working on. The details were classified. But I tried to share what I could. "We've been coordinating with allied units in the Pacific on cyber threat mapping," I said, hoping at least to pique their interest. Mark interrupted before I could finish. "So, like, spreadsheets?" The room erupted in laughter. My father chuckled into his drink. My aunt shook her head, grinning. I laughed too, because what else could I do? But inside, I felt that old familiar weight settle in my chest. What they didn't know, what they never cared to ask, was that spreadsheets had, just 2 weeks earlier, contained the intelligence that prevented a mid-sea collision between a U.S. destroyer and an unmarked foreign vessel operating without transponders. But that was the point of my work. Success meant nothing happened. It meant no one knew. There was no parade for the crises that never materialized. As the years went on, the gap between what I did and what they thought I did grew wider. I rose through the ranks, slowly at first, then in leaps, taking on assignments that came with higher clearance levels and heavier responsibilities. Each new role meant more time away from family, more secrets I couldn't share, and more assumptions from them that I'd stalled out somewhere in a safe, invisible corner of the Navy. The few times I tried to correct them, it backfired. At my cousin's engagement party 5 years ago, my aunt was telling a group of guests that Mark would finally be the first in our family to take on a true leadership role in the Navy. I stepped in and mentioned that I'd recently been made a division head in my department. She smiled tightly. "That's nice, dear, but you know what I mean. The kind of leadership people can see." I stopped trying after that. By the time this awards ceremony rolled around, the erasure wasn't just habit, it was tradition. They had built a whole family narrative around who mattered and who didn't, and I was firmly in the didn't column. The thing about being underestimated for so long is that it changes you. At first, it hurts. You want to fight it, to prove them wrong in every possible way. But eventually, you realize the real power isn't in convincing them. It's in knowing you don't have to. You can let them talk, let them laugh, let them tell anyone who will listen that you're not cut out for service, not smart enough, not visible enough to matter. Because while they're doing that, you're moving in spaces they don't even know exist. I'd been moving in those spaces for years now, and today, they were going to find out just how far I'd gone. I didn't need their applause. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious to see their faces when the truth finally came out. And the best part? I wouldn't have to say a single word. If my family's world was all about what you could see, uniforms at formal dinners, photos on mantels, speeches from podiums, my world was the opposite. The fewer people who saw what I did, the better I was doing it. The place I worked most days didn't even have a name you could say out loud. Officially, it was an annex of a Pentagon department you've probably never heard of. Unofficially, it was the tank, a sealed, windowless nerve center buried several floors underground, where the air was cool and dry and carried the faint tang of ozone from the endless hum of servers. It wasn't glamorous in the way my cousin imagined military life to be. No roaring jet engines, no ceremonial salutes on sunlit decks. The tank was lit by the glow of monitors, arranged in a wide arc that surrounded the watch officer's desk like the bridge of a starship. On a good day, the room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. On a bad one, it smelled like burnt circuits and too many hours without fresh air. The morning after I got the call from Admiral Carson about the ceremony, I was back at my station before sunrise. I still had a job to do. "Ma'am, drone feed is live," Petty Officer Lee said, swiveling one of the screens toward me. His voice was calm, but I caught the tension in his eyes. On the monitor, the grainy image of a freighter appeared, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Strait of Hormuz. It was supposed to be carrying nothing but industrial solvents to a port in Oman. My gut told me otherwise. "Thermal scan?" I asked. The image shifted, colors bleeding into orange and red blobs. There, low and toward the stern, were heat signatures that didn't match the manifest. "How many?" "7, moving in pairs." That was enough. In this part of the world, 7 unaccounted-for signatures on a supposedly civilian vessel could mean anything from armed smugglers to a covert boarding team waiting for the right moment. I keyed my mic, my voice steady, measured. "Ghost Rider, this is Echo Control. Adjust approach vector. Maintain current distance. Stand by for revised boarding orders. Somewhere out on that dark water, a Navy boarding team was waiting for my go-ahead. Men and women who couldn't see what I was seeing, who were trusting me to make the call that could save their lives. While my family imagined me shuffling papers in some beige office, this was my daily reality, sifting through a dozen feeds, signals and whispers, piecing together a threat picture from fragments. One wrong call, one missed detail, and people could die. A comms tech handed me a new set of satellite images. I spread them out across the desk, the way another person might spread playing cards. One image caught my eye, a small, low-profile skiff cutting across the water from the east. No navigation lights, no transponder signal. "Lee, match this course to the freighter's current trajectory," I said. He tapped a few keys. The two plotted lines converged like magnets. ETA, 15 minutes. I didn't need to think about it. My voice was sharp, decisive, when I keyed the mic again. "Ghost Rider, negative on boarding. Break off and shadow. Possible hostile approach inbound. Stand by for further." "Copy that," came the reply, flat and professional. We watched as the skiff closed the distance. I felt the knot of tension in my chest tighten. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the high-wire awareness of knowing every second mattered, and I was balancing on the edge of those seconds. 2 more feeds popped up on the main display. Infrared from a high-altitude drone and a real-time radar sweep from a destroyer stationed 20 nautical miles west. The picture was coming together, piece by piece, like a puzzle I'd been solving my whole career. "Contact confirmed," Lee said, his voice low. 6 armed, heavy weapons. I felt my jaw set. The freighter's mystery cargo wasn't barrels of solvent. It was people, dangerous ones. And if our team had boarded, they would have been walking into an ambush. The decision was simple now. I keyed the mic one last time. "Ghost Rider, disengage. Maintain visual at safe distance. We'll take it from here." There was a pause, just a fraction longer than usual before the team leader responded. "Roger that, Echo. Thanks for the heads up." Thanks. The only thanks we ever got. There'd be no press release, no mention in any ceremony, just another near miss that wouldn't make it past classified logs. That was the work. That was my work. After the skiff was intercepted by Allied forces and the freighter rerouted for inspection, the tank returned to its usual low murmur. Analysts went back to their desks. Someone brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The tension bled out of the room like air from a valve. I sat back in my chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose, and thought about Mark's smirk at the gate the other day, about my aunt's faint, patronizing smile. They thought my job was safe, invisible, unimportant. They didn't know that on more days than I could count, my decisions determined whether strangers halfway around the world lived to see another sunrise. I wasn't sure if they'd ever really understand the stakes, but soon they'd at least know the title. And maybe, just maybe, they'd feel that weight for the first time. The meeting request came through my secured channel just after 0700 the following morning. From ADM Carson, FleetCom. Subject, drop by my office. Urgent. Admiral Carson wasn't the kind of man who used urgent lightly. In our world, that word had weight, the kind that could mean anything from an imminent operational crisis to a political firestorm that needed diffusing. I made my way across the Pentagon's maze of corridors, my ID badge clipped high, my thoughts shifting through possible scenarios. The last time I'd been called up like this, we'd been chasing an encrypted comms signal through 3 different intelligence agencies, trying to confirm if it belonged to a terrorist financier. His door was open when I arrived. He was standing behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the Potomac. Morning light spilled across the polished wood, catching the faint silver in his close-cropped hair. "Commander?" he said, turning toward me with a small, wry smile. "I hear you saved Ghost Rider's skin yesterday." I didn't bother with false modesty. The skiff was a setup. We pulled them back in time. His nod was approving, but there was something else in his eyes, a measured calculation, the kind he used when weighing a move on a chessboard. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. He poured 2 mugs of coffee from the carafe on the sideboard and handed me one before taking his seat. We sat for a moment in silence, the muted hum of the HVAC the only sound. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You've been in intelligence for, 15 years now?" 16, sir. And in that time, you've run operations across 4 theaters, managed multi-agency coordination, and led some of the most complex cyber intel campaigns we've had in the last decade." I raised an eyebrow. "Is this my mid-year review?" That earned me the faintest ghost of a grin. "Not quite. It's your promotion interview." I blinked. "Sir?" Carson's voice stayed level, but there was a spark in it now. "Fleet Command is reorganizing the Intelligence Directorate. We're moving from a dispersed command structure to a centralized leadership model, and we need someone who can run that, someone who can keep the operational picture clear across every theater." It took a beat for the weight of his words to land. "You're talking about head of intelligence." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "And your name's at the top of the list." My first thought wasn't pride, it was disbelief. That position was held by officers with careers twice as long as mine, people whose faces were known across the Pentagon. "I appreciate the confidence, sir, but—" He held up a hand. "Don't sell yourself short. You've been in the shadows long enough. Half the people in this building couldn't pick you out of a lineup, but the ones who matter, they know exactly who you are, and they know what you've done." I took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the coffee mug seep into my hands. "Why now?" "Because the work you've been doing, the kind of work that saves ships without firing a shot, is the future of this fight. We need someone who understands that. And," he added with a sidelong glance, "because sometimes the right move is also the poetic one." I frowned. "Poetic?" Carson's smile widened, just slightly. "I saw your family at the gate yesterday." The memory flickered. Mark's smirk. My aunt's hand tightening on her keys, the guard's polite dismissal. "You didn't say a word," Carson continued. "Didn't pull rank. You let them think whatever they wanted to think." I held his gaze. I wasn't going to win anything by correcting them. "Exactly," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And that's why I think you should let the truth come out on its own, publicly." I could feel my pulse in my throat. "You want to announce this at the ceremony?" "That's the idea," he said. "Your cousin's commendation is scheduled first. Then we add an unscheduled item to the program." He tapped his pen once against the desk. "We call you up, read your orders, and the whole room, including your family, learns exactly what you've been doing all these years." I let the idea settle in the air between us. It was audacious. A part of me recoiled from the sheer exposure of it. But another part, the part that had carried every quiet dismissal and swallowed every cutting remark, recognized the elegance of it. No arguments, no defensiveness, just fact, read aloud by a 4-star admiral in front of everyone whose opinion had ever been used as a weapon against me. "Your call," Carson said finally, his tone softening. "We can do it quietly in my office with a handshake, or we can do it in the light, where it belongs." I set my coffee down, the porcelain clinking softly against the desk. "Let's do it in the light." The Admiral's smile was slow and deliberate, the kind that said he'd known my answer before I spoke. "Good. Then I suggest you keep this under wraps until the big moment. Let them wonder why you're there. Let them think you're just in the crowd." I nodded. "Understood." As I stood to leave, Carson's voice stopped me at the door. "One more thing, Commander. When you walk up to that stage, I want you to remember, you're not just accepting a promotion, you're accepting your place where it's always belonged." I met his eyes and gave a single steady nod. "Yes, sir." The walk back to my office felt different. The usual bustle of the Pentagon seemed muted, as if my mind had pushed the rest of the world into the background. Head of Intelligence, I could already see it. The stage, the flag, Carson's voice carrying across the room, and my cousin's smile, freezing in place, turning brittle as the words landed. It wasn't revenge I wanted. Not exactly. But I wasn't going to pretend I didn't want them to feel the truth hit. Not just hear it, feel it. For 16 years, I'd operated where no one could see me. In a few weeks, the curtain would lift, and they'd realize just how wrong they'd been. The days between Admiral Carson's offer and the ceremony passed in a strange sort of dual reality. On the surface, it was business as usual. Daily briefs, classified updates, coordination calls, with commanders halfway across the globe. But beneath it, there was a quiet current running through me, a steady hum of anticipation that I kept locked behind a practiced, neutral expression. Not even my closest colleagues knew. That was deliberate. In intelligence, you learn quickly that the fewer people who know the details, the cleaner the operation. This was no different. On the third night, I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, my dress whites laid out in precise alignment across the back of a chair. The fabric gleamed faintly in the low light, the two silver eagles on my shoulder boards catching the glow. Soon, those would be replaced by the gold and silver insignia of a Rear Admiral. The temptation to call someone, to tell even one person, was there. But I kept coming back to Carson's words. Let them wonder why you're there. The element of surprise wasn't just satisfying, it was strategic. For years, I'd watch my family adjust their behavior in the moment they realized I'd accomplished something they hadn't expected. If they knew beforehand, they'd have time to prepare a performance, a polished facade of pride, a few well-rehearsed compliments, a convenient erasure of everything they'd ever said to the contrary. Number I didn't want the scripted version. I wanted the truth, raw and unfiltered, to land exactly as it should, in the stunned silence that follows the removal of every illusion. The night before the ceremony, I went through the motions of my usual routine, but there was a deliberate weight to every step. I ironed the uniform myself instead of sending it to the base cleaners, pressing each crease until it was razor sharp. I polished my shoes until they reflected back the shape of the kitchen light. On the table, I set a small black velvet box, the one Carson had given me when he briefed me on the promotion. Inside were the new insignia, 2 silver stars for each shoulder. I picked one up, feeling its cool weight in my palm. It wasn't just metal. It was 16 years of late nights in the tank, of calls made in seconds that changed the outcome of entire operations. It was the lives of people I'd never meet, but had protected all the same. The sound of the pins locking into place tomorrow would be for me, and for the young woman I'd been when I started this career, believing that if I just worked hard enough, my family would see me for who I was. I set the star back in the box and closed it gently. The morning of the ceremony broke clear and bright, the kind of spring day that makes everything feel sharper. I arrived early, parking a block away so I could walk the last stretch alone. My trench coat, beige, unassuming, covered the full uniform. From a distance, I looked like any other guest. I could see them from halfway down the block. My aunt's posture was unmistakable, stiff and upright, her purse tucked close under her arm. Mark was beside her in full dress uniform, the sheen of his freshly polished shoes catching the sunlight. Even from here, I could see the easy confidence in his stance, the way his shoulders were set just so. As I approached, I slowed my pace just enough to let them notice me. My aunt glanced my way first, her mouth twitching into a polite, tight smile. Mark turned next, his expression flickering briefly into something sharper. Annoyance, maybe, before settling back into a smirk. "You made it," he said, as if I'd stumbled into the wrong event. "I did," I replied evenly, "looking forward to the ceremony." He shrugged. Hope you get a good seat. They fill up fast." I let the remark pass without reaction. The trench coat hid the set of my shoulders, the gleam of my collar, the ribbons aligned with perfect precision over my left breast pocket. They had no idea, and that was the point. Inside, the seating area was already buzzing with conversation. Rows of white chairs faced the stage, where the podium stood draped in the Navy flag. The front section was cordoned off with a velvet rope, VIP seating. Carson had arranged for me to sit there, but I didn't head that way immediately. Instead, I lingered near the back, moving through the crowd quietly. I shook hands with a few familiar faces from other commands, careful not to draw attention. When I finally made my way to the front, it was only because Carson himself appeared at my side, greeting me with a firm handshake and a subtle nod. "Glad you're here," he said, his voice carrying just enough to turn a few nearby heads. "Right this way." We walked together to the VIP section, and I felt the weight of eyes following us. I didn't look back, but I didn't have to. I could almost hear the gears turning in Mark's head, trying to slot this new piece of information into the narrative he'd built about me. As I took my seat, I kept my gaze forward on the stage. My coat stayed on, buttoned at the collar. The stars in the velvet box in my lap were still hidden, their moment not yet come. I'd made my choice. There would be no hints, no warnings. My silence was a blade, and I was going to let it cut clean. The sun had climbed higher now, casting long, distinct shadows across the pavement. The entrance to the ceremonial grounds was funneled through a single checkpoint, manned by 2 enlisted security personnel in crisp uniforms, their expressions neutral but attentive. I walked toward it with measured steps, the soft click of my shoes syncing with the rhythmic thud of boots ahead of me. Mark and my aunt were already in line. From the way his shoulders lifted when he spoke to the guard, I could tell he was in storytelling mode. Chest slightly out, chin tilted up, voice just loud enough to carry. "Yes, Lieutenant Mark Hayes," he was saying. "Family's all here. Well, most of them." Then, without looking back, he added, "Except for my cousin. She's not exactly Navy material." The guard gave a polite half-smile, clearly not sure if it was a joke. My aunt chuckled quietly, the kind of light, performative laugh meant to signal she was in on it. Her car keys were back in her hand, the metal jingling against each other with every small shift of her wrist. When it was my turn, the younger of the 2 guards stepped forward, scanning my face briefly before lowering his eyes to the tablet in his hand. "Name, ma'am?" "Sophia Hayes." His finger moved down the digital list, scrolling, scanning. Then he stopped, frowned slightly, and looked up. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the guest list for this ceremony." Behind me, I could hear Mark's voice, pitched just enough for the people in earshot to catch. "Told you." She probably came to watch from the fence line. It was a line designed to get a laugh, and from the 2 middle-aged men standing just behind him, it did. A short, low chuckle, the kind that makes your skin feel 2 sizes too tight. I didn't take the bait. "Are you sure?" I asked the guard, my tone even, almost curious. He turned the screen toward me, showing the neatly typed names. Mark's parents, his wife, a few other relatives I barely knew. My name was absent, the empty space between the lines practically humming with intent. This wasn't an oversight. This was calculated. "I understand," I said, and stepped slightly aside, letting the next guest forward. Mark couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Don't worry, Soph. Maybe next time they'll let you work the coffee table." He grinned like he'd just landed a perfect punchline. My aunt shook her head. Not at him, but at me, as if my very presence here was somehow embarrassing for her. She angled her body toward the gate, her voice low. "Don't cause a scene." It was almost funny in a bitter way. The years I'd spent working in spaces they didn't even know existed. The moments when I'd been seconds away from ordering lethal force. And here she was, afraid I'd raise my voice in public. I stood still, hands at my sides, posture relaxed. Let them think they'd boxed me out. Let them believe I'd been relegated to the spectator section. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught the slow approach of a sleek, black sedan. It rolled to a stop beside the checkpoint, its paint gleaming like a mirror in the morning light. The rear door opened, and Admiral Carson stepped out. The effect was immediate. Both guards straightened, spines snapping into perfect alignment, their salutes crisp and sharp. Conversations in the immediate vicinity dipped in volume as heads turned. Carson took in the scene in a single sweep. The gate, the guards, the guests queued behind the rope. His eyes landed on me and stayed there. "There you are, Commander Hayes," he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "We were wondering if you'd arrived yet." The guard nearest me froze for half a beat, then looked like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "Sir, my apologies," he stammered. "I didn't realize—" Carson's expression didn't shift. "It's fine, petty officer. She's with me." With that, he placed a steady hand on my elbow, a small, deliberate gesture that nonetheless drew more eyes. Without looking back, he led me through the open gate. I didn't have to glance over my shoulder to know Mark was watching. I could feel it, like the warmth of a spotlight on the back of my neck. The easy smirk he'd been wearing earlier had faltered. I imagined him trying to rearrange his face, to smooth over the cracks in his confidence before anyone noticed. We walked past rows of neatly arranged chairs, the velvet rope to the VIP section already unhooked for us. Carson gestured to the front row, center seats, where the view of the stage was unobstructed. As I sat, I let my gaze sweep briefly toward the general seating area. Mark was still standing with my aunt, both of them in mid-conversation with another couple, but their eyes kept sliding in my direction. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that in less than an hour, the assumptions they'd been living on for years were going to collapse in real time. And I wasn't going to have to lift a finger to make it happen. Admiral Carson didn't waste time with small talk. Once I was seated, he leaned over just enough to say, "Program will run exactly as briefed. You'll know when it's your cue." Then he sat back, his gaze fixed on the stage as if nothing in the world could pull him from the moment ahead. I let my hands rest lightly on my lap, the black velvet box hidden beneath them. The stars inside felt heavier than they should have, not just metal, but years of silence, years of dismissal compressed into two small pieces of silver. The VIP section filled quickly. Uniforms outnumbered suits and dresses, the air thick with the quiet authority of people who'd been making high-level decisions for decades. Some I recognized immediately, a vice admiral from Pacific Command whose operations I'd quietly supported more than once, a Marine Corps general who had signed off on joint intel briefs I'd authored under another officer's name, a decorated captain whose ship had been pulled out of harm's way because of a signal intercept my team had flagged in the middle of the night, and they recognized me. "Commander Hayes," the vice admiral said as he approached, his handshake firm, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "I hear we have you to thank for Black Turn last fall." "Just doing my job, sir," I replied evenly, though my pulse quickened. Black Turn had been one of our most delicate operations, one so sensitive that only a handful of people knew my role. The Marine general stepped forward next, his gravelly voice warm. "You and your analysts saved my boys' skins in the Gulf. I've been wanting to shake your hand for a long time." We exchanged a brief nod, the kind that carries more weight than a dozen speeches. Every interaction chipped away at the invisible wall my family had built between who they thought I was and who I actually am. From the corner of my vision, I could see Mark watching, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and calculation. My aunt sat beside him, angled slightly forward, her keys still in her hand like a talisman. They couldn't hear the words being spoken, but they could see the body language, the deference, the familiarity. They could see that here, in this section, I wasn't the extra chair at the table. I was a peer. I didn't look at them directly. That was part of the strategy. No acknowledgement, no invitation to engage. The less attention I gave them now, the more potent the shock would be when the spotlight shifted. The ceremony began with the familiar notes of the national anthem, followed by the MC's opening remarks. My posture was textbook perfect. Back straight, shoulders squared, chin level. Years in the service had trained me to be still in moments like these, to project calm no matter what my thoughts were doing. The MC moved into the awards portion, starting with a handful of commendations for junior officers. Polite applause rose and fell with each name. Then came Mark's turn. Lieutenant Mark Hayes, the MC announced, is recognized for meritorious service in support of combat operations during his recent deployment. Mark stood with practiced ease, his uniform immaculate, his smile calibrated for both humility and pride. As he walked to the stage, I watched the slight swing of his shoulders, the easy confidence that came from a lifetime of being told he belonged there. He accepted his medal, posed for the photo, then turned to the microphone. His speech was smooth. A thank you to his commanding officers, a nod to the Navy for the honor, heartfelt words for his parents' support, a wink to his wife in the audience. Not once did he look my way. Not once did my name pass his lips. The applause was generous, bordering on enthusiastic. Mark returned to his seat with a satisfied tilt to his chin, glancing toward the VIP section as if expecting someone there to recognize him. Our eyes met for less than a heartbeat, and then I turned mine back to the stage. The MC shuffled his papers, cleared his throat. "And now," he said, "we have an unscheduled addition to today's program. For reasons of national security, this recognition has been kept confidential until this moment." The air changed. I felt it ripple through the crowd, a subtle shift in posture, a hush that fell over even the back rows. People leaned forward, curious. Admiral Carson rose from his seat beside me, his movements deliberate, commanding. Mark's head swiveled toward the Borgie stage, his brow creasing slightly. My aunt shifted in her chair, her keys slipping into her purse with a faint metallic chime. I kept my gaze forward, my expression neutral. Inside, my heartbeat slowed to a steady, almost meditative rhythm. It was almost time. Admiral Carson took the podium like it was built for him. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. His voice filled the space without strain, the low, controlled rumble of someone who had addressed thousands, yet made each person feel as if they were the only one in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we rightly honor those whose service is visible, those on the front lines, in the air, on the seas. Their dedication and courage are the backbone of our Navy." Polite applause followed. I sat perfectly still, eyes forward. "But there is another kind of service," Carson continued, "one that happens far from the cameras, in rooms without windows, often without recognition, and always without fanfare. The kind of service where victories are measured not in battles won, but in tragedies prevented, where the only evidence of success is the absence of disaster." The murmurs began immediately. Small, curious glances darted across the audience. Mark's head tilted slightly toward my aunt, as if to silently ask, "What's this about?" Carson let the pause hang, long enough for the air itself to feel charged. "Today," he said, "we have the privilege of acknowledging one such career, one such leader, whose work has safeguarded thousands of lives and preserved the operational integrity of our fleet across multiple theaters." His words were deliberate, each syllable carrying weight. For the first time, parts of her record can now be spoken of publicly. Her. I didn't have to see them to know my aunt's brows had drawn together. Mark's smirk, the one he'd worn so easily this morning, was probably flickering, unsure whether to hold or drop. Carson shifted his stance, bracing both hands lightly on the podium's edges. "The officer I am speaking of has led intelligence operations across the Pacific, the Gulf, and the Mediterranean. She has coordinated multi-agency responses to emergent threats in real time, intercepting hostile actions before they could claim lives. A few officers in the audience exchanged knowing looks, the kind you only share when you've been in the room for the debrief of one of those operations. Her leadership during Operation Winter Gate, Carson said, prevented the loss of an Allied vessel and its crew to an armed boarding in hostile waters. More recently, her command oversight of a classified maritime surveillance network provided the actionable intelligence that saved an entire strike group from a coordinated missile ambush. I kept my breathing slow, steady. My hands rested lightly on the velvet box in my lap, my thumb running over the seam of the lid. Carson's gaze swept the room, landing for a brief, pointed second on the general seating section where my family sat. It is my profound honor to announce that, effective immediately, this officer is promoted to Rear Admiral and appointed Head of Intelligence for Fleet Command. The reaction was instant. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the second row, the ripple of murmurs swelling into an audible wave, chairs scraped faintly against the floor as a uniformed captain in the front row stood. And then another, and another, until protocol took over and the entire uniformed audience rose to their feet. All except 3. I finally turned my head just slightly, enough to catch the tableau in the corner of my vision. My aunt was frozen, one hand still curled around the edge of her purse strap. My uncle's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on Carson as if the words could somehow be unspoken. And Mark looked like he'd just been doused in cold water. His mouth was half open, his breath caught mid-laugh, the sound never making it past his throat. "And so," Carson said, the barest hint of a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth, "it is my privilege to call to the stage Rear Admiral Sophia Hayes." There it was, my cue. I rose slowly, sliding the velvet box into my hand as I stood. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, each step to the aisle measured. The crowd's applause built around me, but my focus was on the stage, not the faces I passed. As I mounted the steps, Carson extended his hand. His grip was strong, steady. He leaned in just enough for his words to be for me alone. "Let them see you." I turned to face the audience, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of uniforms and civilian attire. My eyes paused, just for a fraction of a second, on Mark. His face was pale, his posture stiff. My aunt sat rigid beside him, staring at me like she was seeing a ghost. The velvet box was warm in my palm now. In a moment, the stars inside would be on my shoulders. And when they were, no one in this room, not even my family, would be able to pretend they hadn't seen them. Admiral Carson took the black velvet box from my hand with the kind of precision only years of ceremony could produce. He opened it slowly, almost ceremonially, so the crowd could see the 2 silver stars glint under the stage lights. "By the authority vested in me by the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy," he said, "I hereby promote Commander Sophia Hayes to the rank of Rear Admiral and appoint her as Head of Intelligence Fleet Command." The applause swelled, sharp and sustained, the kind that rolls forward like a wave, gathering force as it moves. Carson stepped closer, fastening the stars to each of my shoulder boards with deliberate, steady hands. The click of the pins locking into place was louder in my ears than the clapping. "Admiral," he said, meeting my eyes. With a brief, respectful nod, "You have the con." I returned the nod, a subtle acknowledgement that I understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. He gestured for me to turn toward the audience, and I did. My posture was textbook perfect. Shoulders square, chin lifted just enough, eyes level. From here, the view was a living map of reactions. The front rows were a wall of respect, officers standing ramrod straight, hands clasped behind their backs, expressions neutral, but their eyes sharp with recognition. Some smiled faintly, not in a casual, friendly way, but with the quiet approval reserved for someone whose work they truly value. Further back, among the civilians, the reactions were less disciplined. A few mouths hung open. Some leaned toward their neighbors, whispering in quick bursts, eyes flicking between me and Carson like they were replaying the speech in their heads to make sure they'd heard it right. And then there was my family. My aunt's hand had found her keys again. They dangled loosely from her fingers, the motionless metal glinting in her lap. Her mouth was a thin, pale line, her eyes narrowed as if squinting would somehow bring the scene into focus. Mark was something else entirely. The smirk was gone. The carefully curated confidence had drained out of him, leaving a stiffness in its place. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the insignia on my shoulders like they were in a foreign language he couldn't translate. For just a heartbeat, his gaze met mine, and I saw it. The moment he connected the dots, the operations Carson had named, the intercepts, the saved strike group, he knew exactly which ship had been pulled back from that missile ambush. His ship. His mouth closed, his jaw tightened. Carson began reading from my official citation, a distilled version of 16 years' worth of classified work, scrubbed clean of specifics, but still potent in what it revealed. Her analytical leadership has directly prevented hostile incursions into U.S. waters, dismantled foreign espionage networks, and coordinated real-time responses to emergent threats, safeguarding countless lives. Each line was a small detonation, not just for the crowd, but for the people who had written me off as someone who'd barely made it in the Navy. The applause returned as Carson closed the citation. I shook his hand again, then stepped back from the podium. I didn't wave, didn't bow my head in humility. I stood still, letting the moment settle like dust after a controlled demolition. From my vantage point, I could see the ripple effect in the audience. Officers exchanging nods, civilians craning for a better look. And in the middle of it, my family frozen in their own small island of disbelief. It would have been easy to let my eyes linger on them, to savor the impact. But I turned away first, stepping down from the stage and back toward my seat beside Carson. As I sat, I felt the stars on my shoulders shift slightly with the movement. Not heavy, but present, permanent. The MC's voice carried over the speakers again, moving on to the next item on the program. The ceremony wasn't over, but for me, the battle was already won. I didn't need to hear whatever Mark might say later. I didn't need my aunt's forced congratulations. The truth had been spoken aloud in front of people whose respect mattered far more than theirs ever could. I glanced at Carson, who was watching the stage with that same steady composure he always carried. He caught my eye for a second and gave the smallest of nods, the kind that said, "You did exactly what you needed to do." I let my gaze drift back to the crowd, not searching for my family, but seeing them anyway. My aunt had set her keys down now, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Mark hadn't moved, still leaning forward, still staring like the stars on my shoulders might vanish if he looked away long enough. They weren't going anywhere, and neither was I. The rest of the ceremony moved forward, but I could feel the shift in the air. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you'd spent years reading a room full of officers, allies, and adversaries. A recalibration. Every time a name was read, every time an award was presented, there was a small delay before the applause began. It wasn't disrespect, it was distraction. People were still processing what had just happened. I sat with my hands folded loosely in my lap, posture steady, eyes on the stage. Carson was still there beside me, his presence solid and grounding. He leaned slightly toward me as the next recipient walked up. "You'll notice," he murmured, "how the energy has changed. They're thinking about you now, not him." I didn't need to ask who him was. From where I sat, I had a direct line of sight to Mark. He'd shifted in his chair, arms crossed now, head tilted down just enough to make him look closed off. His eyes flicked toward the aisle once, twice, the kind of restless glances you make when you're calculating an exit. But he stayed. My aunt, on the other hand, had gone still in that unnatural way people do when they're trying to project calm but can't control the tension in their hands. She had her purse in her lap, both hands clasped over it like she was guarding something inside. The MC announced the final honoree of the afternoon, a young lieutenant receiving a commendation for meritorious service. The applause was warm, genuine, but even as I clapped, I could feel eyes darting toward me in the periphery. I wasn't imagining it. You can tell when you've become the center of gravity in a room. When the ceremony concluded, everyone rose for the benediction. As the chaplain's words rolled over the audience, my mind was already moving, ahead. I'd spent the past hour letting the facts speak for themselves, letting Carson's introduction and the formal promotion do the talking, but there was still the matter of the personal reckoning, the one that had been years in the making. The moment "Amen" was spoken, the room broke into motion. The aisle filled with uniforms, the soft murmur of conversation rising with the shuffle of feet. I turned to Carson, who was already standing. "You'll have a line," he said quietly. "People will want to shake your hand." He wasn't wrong. The first few approached immediately. Captains, commanders, even a few civilians who introduced themselves as defense contractors or congressional aides. Each handshake was firm, each congratulations delivered with the kind of sincerity you can't fake. "You've made quite an impression, Admiral," one captain said, his voice low but carrying the weight of respect. "I've been in the room for a couple of your briefings. You've earned every bit of this." I thanked him, meeting each gaze steadily, letting the moment belong to the work rather than the politics. Behind them, I could see my family weaving through the crowd. My aunt's expression hadn't softened. If anything, the tightness in her jaw had deepened. Mark was a step behind her, scanning the room as if hoping for an escape route. I continued to receive congratulations. A Rear Admiral I'd worked with in the Gulf Theater, a civilian analyst whose intel package I'd once pushed through at midnight to prevent a diplomatic crisis. Each exchange built the wall higher, made it clearer that the version of me my family had clung to was outdated, irrelevant. When the stream of well-wishers finally thinned, Carson placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "I'll give you a moment," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the figures hovering at the edge of the crowd. "But don't let them take it from you." And then he was gone, swallowed into another cluster of uniforms, leaving me standing in the soft hum of the aftermath. My aunt approached first, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She stopped just short of arm's length. "Sophia," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." "Was it?" I asked evenly. "I've been doing this work for years." Mark stepped forward then, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine for the first time I could remember. "Head of Intelligence," he said quietly, almost like he was testing the words. "You could have told me." I tilted my head. "And you could have put my name on the guest list." That landed. His shoulders tensed, the way they always had when he knew he had no clean comeback. Before either could say more, another officer came up beside me, offering his congratulations and a warm handshake. My aunt and Mark stepped back automatically, edged out by the current of uniformed bodies that still wanted a moment of my time. I let them drift. This wasn't the confrontation. Not yet. That would come when the formalities ended, when the audience left, when there was nothing between us but the truth. For now, I had something more important to do, stand here, in plain sight, as everything they thought they knew about me unraveled. The last handshake was still warm when the MC's voice announced the reception in the adjoining hall. People began filtering out in clusters, their chatter a mixture of professional congratulations and personal catching up. I moved with the flow, letting the hum of voices act as a buffer. But I could feel it. The trailing presence just behind me, the cadence of steps I knew without looking. I reached the double doors leading into the reception area. Carson caught my eye from across the room, raising his glass in a subtle toast before he was surrounded again by officers in full dress. He wasn't coming to save me this time. He didn't need to. I stepped into the hall, the air cooler here, the scent of coffee and polished wood mingling. The lighting was softer, less formal, the noise dampened by the high ceiling. This was the in-between space, the place where official and personal could collide without an audience of brass watching. Mark came up on my right, my aunt flanking the left. It was deliberate. The old tactic of boxing someone in, a maneuver I'd seen in countless interrogation rooms. "You made quite a show," my aunt said, her tone pitched low but sharp enough to cut. "I didn't make a show," I replied. "I accepted a promotion." Mark let out a humorless laugh. "You could have told us." I stopped walking. The shift in my posture was enough to make them stop too. We stood there in the wide corridor, sunlight from a tall window cutting across the floor like a dividing line. "You mean the way you told me I wasn't invited today?" I asked. "That was a misunderstanding," my aunt said quickly, too quickly. "No," I said, meeting her gaze head on. "It was deliberate. You didn't want me here because you thought I'd embarrass you. You thought I'd be out of place." Her lips thinned further. "It wasn't personal." "It was exactly personal." My voice stayed level, but the steadiness was deliberate. Years of debriefing rooms, of talking down hostile agents, had taught me the power of calm over volume. Mark's eyes darted to the floor. "It wasn't about you not being good enough. It was exactly about that," I cut in. "Don't rewrite it now. You've made comments for years about me being book smart but not real world smart, about how I got lucky to even make it past lieutenant. Today wasn't luck, Mark. It was the result of work you never even saw." He opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw shifted like he was grinding down the next words before they could escape. "My?" Aunt stepped in then, voice dropping to a whisper even though the nearest group was a good 20 feet away. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look? You being in that position? People will talk." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. "People will talk? About what? That your niece is the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the fleet? That she prevented a missile strike that would have taken out her cousin's ship?" Mark's head snapped up at that, eyes narrowing. "You—" "Yes," I said, cutting him off again. "That mission Carson mentioned, the one where a carrier group was recalled at the last minute, that was me, my team. We intercepted the comms. We traced the launch order. We shut it down before it hit your hull. And you didn't even know it." He stared at me like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. My aunt's keys were in her hand again, her thumb worrying over the metal like a nervous tick. "You could have told us sooner," she muttered, but the edge in her voice was already dulling. "I didn't need to tell you," I said quietly. "You wouldn't have believed it anyway." For a moment, no one spoke. The noise from the reception hall drifted in. Clinking glasses, polite laughter, the faint strains of a string quartet. Mark was the first to break. "So what now?" "Now?" I glanced toward the hall where a dozen people I respected were waiting to talk shop, to plan the next operation, to toast the next chapter. "Now I go enjoy the rest of my evening, and you figure out how you want to tell the story of today, because either way, the facts don't change." I stepped past them, not looking back. The sunlight from the window spilled over my shoulder as I crossed into the reception, the murmur of conversation swallowing me up again. Behind me, I didn't hear footsteps following. The reception hall was already buzzing when I stepped inside, the kind of low, constant hum that comes from a mix of clinking glasses, polite conversation, and the rustle of formal uniforms. The lighting was warmer here, golden, bouncing off the polished mahogany trim and tall windows. The tension from the confrontation in the corridor hadn't clung to me. I'd left it outside with them. A steward in a crisp white jacket passed by with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one, letting the stem rest cool against my fingers. I didn't drink much in uniform, habit from deployments, but tonight wasn't about the alcohol. It was about the gesture. Almost immediately, a small group gravitated toward me, a mixture of officers, civilian analysts, and two visiting dignitaries from an allied nation. They knew my name now. More importantly, they knew my title. Admiral Hayes, one of the analysts began. I wanted to thank you personally for the intel you shared last year on the Baltic operation. Without it, the delays in the supply chain could have been catastrophic. I inclined my head. It was a team effort. I just made sure it landed on the right desk at the right time. The dignitary beside him, a woman in a dove-gray suit, smiled faintly. That's a skill in itself. You know, your promotion has already made its way into the embassy chatter. Word travels fast when it's good news. I let the corner of my mouth lift, but not too far. In my line of work, modesty wasn't an act. It was armor. Over the next half hour, the conversation shifted seamlessly from congratulations to strategy. We discussed upcoming joint operations, the potential impact of emerging cyber threats, and the finer points of interagency cooperation. The kind of conversations I'd lived for. The ones where my mind felt engaged, alive, needed. Somewhere near the far wall, I caught sight of Mark and my aunt. They weren't mingling. They weren't even pretending to enjoy themselves. My aunt stood rigidly, glass in hand, eyes darting toward me every few seconds. Mark had taken to studying the framed photographs on the wall, portraits of decorated officers from decades past, as if the faces could offer him a way out of the discomfort. I didn't approach them. Not yet. Tonight, my silence would be louder than any argument. Instead, I stayed in the current of those who valued what I'd done and what I could still do. Rear Admiral Clarkson stopped by to shake my hand, his grip firm. "We've been needing someone with your skill set in that seat for a long time," he said. "Glad command finally caught up with reality." Even Carson reappeared, this time carrying 2 glasses of water instead of champagne. He handed me one without a word, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "You've taken the room," he murmured. "I didn't take it," I said. "It was always mine to begin with." He chuckled low, clearly pleased with the answer, then moved on to speak with a group from Fleet Command. The music shifted. Still strings, but something lighter, more celebratory. I let myself take a slow lap around the room, pausing to greet people I hadn't seen in years. Old shipmates, former intel officers who'd gone private sector. A few even teased me about finally wearing the stars you should have had ages ago. Every so often I felt the prickling awareness of eyes on me from across the room. It wasn't the press. No photographers had been allowed inside. It was my family, still standing at the fringe, watching. They had to stand there and witness it. The respect, the weight of my position, the easy rapport I had with people who actually knew the work I'd done. They couldn't reframe it. They couldn't cut me out of the picture. Not here, not now. By the time the formal toasts began, I'd positioned myself with a small group of senior officers near the center of the room. Carson spoke first, a few brief but pointed words about integrity, persistence, and the value of quiet professionals. His gaze found me twice, but he didn't name me until the end. "To Admiral Hayes," he said, raising his glass, "may your instincts remain sharp, your counsel remain trusted, and your enemies stay in the dark until it's too late." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the group. I lifted my own glass, holding it steady in the air. "And may we never underestimate the quiet ones," I said. The cheer that followed was genuine, and I didn't need to look toward the far wall to know my aunt's glass had lowered a fraction. The rest of the evening unfolded in the same rhythm, respect given, respect returned. I moved from group to group, collecting small moments of connection that would carry far beyond this room. Every handshake, every nod, every shared piece of insight built another layer over the years of dismissiveness my family had piled on. By the time I set my empty glass down on a passing tray, I knew something had shifted permanently. Not just here, but in every room I'd walk into after tonight. And they knew it too. The reception had started to thin. The string quartet was packing up, their bows resting across their instruments between songs, and the waitstaff moved with practiced efficiency, collecting empty glasses and stray plates from the linen-covered tables. The air was still warm with the mingled scents of champagne, perfume, and polished wood, but the hum of conversation had quieted to a softer murmur. I'd made my rounds. I'd spoken with everyone I needed to, and more importantly, everyone who wanted to speak with me. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Carson reappeared at my side, jacket draped over one arm. Leaving soon? I glanced toward the tall double doors that led back into the corridor, the same ones I'd walked through earlier with my aunt and Mark shadowing me like storm clouds. Soon, I said. I have one more thing to do. He followed my gaze. My family was still here. My aunt sat in one of the upholstered chairs near the wall, posture stiff, her untouched drink resting on the low table beside her. Mark stood nearby pretending to scroll through his phone, but clearly aware of me. I could have left without saying a word. In fact, I'd considered it. The clean, surgical exit, no loose ends, no chance for them to twist my words later. But some truths deserved to be delivered in person. I walked toward them, each step deliberate. The room seemed to stretch in those moments, the carpet muffling the sound of my heels. Mark was the first to speak. Heading out? Yes, I said, my tone even. I have an early briefing tomorrow. My aunt lifted her chin. You've had your moment. Congratulations. The words were there, but the warmth was absent, replaced with the brittle politeness of someone forced to acknowledge a reality they wish they could deny. I let the pause hang just long enough before I answered. Thank you, and I truly hope you enjoyed tonight because it may be the last time you see me in a room you didn't think I belonged in. Mark's brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, holding his gaze, I don't need to prove anything to you anymore. Not my worth, not my intelligence, not my place in this family. I shifted my attention to my aunt. For years, you've told me what I'm not. Not smart enough, not strong enough, not enough. You were wrong, and now everyone here knows it. Her fingers tightened around the glass on the table, the faintest tremor betraying her. You don't have to rub it in, she said, her voice low. I allowed myself a small, measured smile. This isn't rubbing it in. This is closure. Mark's voice softened then, almost uncertain. You think this changes things between us? Yes, I said simply, because now I know that the only approval I ever needed was my own. And I've had that for a long time. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for me. I'd been in silence far more dangerous than this, but for them, it seemed to stretch uncomfortably, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. I straightened, smoothing the front of my uniform. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I turned without waiting for a reply. The conversation, if it could even be called that, concluded on my terms. Carson was waiting near the exit, his jacket now over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Done? He asked. Done, I confirmed. We stepped out into the corridor, the quiet a relief after the warm buzz of the reception hall. Outside, the evening air was cool against my face. The city lights glittered in the distance, the hum of traffic a reminder that life outside the military sphere was still moving. As we walked toward the waiting car, I felt no lingering anger, no need to replay their words in my head. That chapter was over. They could keep whatever narrative made them comfortable. It no longer touched me. Carson opened the car door, and as I slid inside, I caught one last glimpse through the tall windows of the reception hall. My aunt and Mark were still in the same spot, their faces unreadable from this distance. For once, I didn't care what they were thinking. I'd entered this day uninvited, underestimated, and unwanted. I was leaving as Admiral Hayes, head of intelligence, and nothing they could say or do would ever change that. The car pulled away, the glow of the building fading in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark sweep of the night. I leaned back, let the silence settle, and for the first time all evening allowed myself the smallest whisper of satisfaction. It wasn't just victory, it was freedom. The hotel suite was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of deep, settled quiet that only comes from thick walls and double-paned windows. I set my cap on the polished wood desk by the door and unpinned my hair, letting it fall in loose waves over my shoulders. The faint impression of my cap brim would be there for a while, a mark from a long day that I didn't mind carrying. I crossed to the window. From here, the city stretched out in a quilt of lights. Street lamps, office towers, headlights tracing thin silver lines through the dark. Somewhere down there, the building where the ceremony had taken place stood like any other, its grand facade now shadowed and still. I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone buzzed once. A text from Carson. "Proud of you. They'll never see you the same way again." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I was still turning over the weight of the day in my mind. The ceremony, the reception, the confrontation in the corridor, each moment had been its own battle, but they'd all fed into the same war I'd been fighting quietly for years. The war against being underestimated by the people who should have known me best. My family's doubt had been a constant, a low hum beneath every achievement. Even when I'd earned commendations, led operations, saved lives, in their eyes, I was still the kid who wouldn't last a year in the service. That narrative had stuck, not because it was true, but because I'd never challenged it head on, until today. I thought about my aunt's face when the Admiral announced my promotion. The flicker of disbelief, the way her mouth had tightened when she realized there was no walking it back, no minimizing it in front of a room full of people who knew exactly what my rank meant. For years, I'd wanted that kind of moment. Not for revenge, but for validation. And now that it had happened, I realized something unexpected. The validation wasn't the real prize. The real prize was knowing I could stand in that room, own every second of it, and walk away without needing their approval at all. I set the water down and leaned back against the headboard, letting the events of the night settle into place. In the military, we talk about clear objectives, knowing your mission, executing it, and accepting that the outcome might not be exactly what you envisioned. Tonight had been like that. My mission hadn't been to humiliate them, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying to watch the smugness fade from my cousin's face. My mission had been to step fully into the rank I'd earned, without shrinking, without apologizing, without letting their voices in my head dictate the volume of my own. A faint hum from the minibar caught my attention, a reminder that I hadn't eaten much all evening. I considered ordering room service, but the idea of sitting in silence a little longer felt more important. I needed to hear myself think without the chatter of a crowded hall or the static of old doubts. I reached for my notebook, the same leather-bound one I'd kept through deployments, promotions, and quiet nights in far-off places. Flipping to a fresh page, I wrote 3 lines. 1. Remember today wasn't the destination. 2. Respect is earned twice. Once in the field, once in the room. 3. You don't need the ones who will never clap for you. The pen paused after the last one, the ink pooling in the curve of the final letter. I closed the notebook, set it on the nightstand, and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. There would be more challenges ahead, more missions, more rooms where people would size me up before I spoke. That was fine. I'd learned something tonight that would carry me through every one of them. The power wasn't in being invited to the table. It was in knowing I could build my own. The phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. Just 3 words. You've changed everything. I stared at it for a moment, then set the phone face down. Whoever it was, they were right. Tomorrow I'd put the uniform back on, step into the role that came with it, and continue the work that mattered. The work that had always mattered, even when no one at home believed I could do it. But tonight, Tonight, I'd allow myself to sit in the quiet, in a city where no one doubted who I was or what I could do. And somewhere, in a small corner of that city, my family was still replaying the moment their version of me shattered in front of everyone they knew. I didn't need to see their faces to know the truth. They'd never speak about me the same way again, and that was enough.